The ballroom glittered like it belonged to another world. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over marble floors, catching on sequins and silk and the slow swirl of champagne in tall glasses. White roses climbed the pillars, intertwined with evergreen branches and silver ribbons, turning the entire room into a winter dream designed to impress. She stood just inside the doorway, her coat still on, her fingers wrapped too tightly around a small clutch she'd borrowed from a friend. Every instinct told her to turn around and leave before anyone noticed she didn't belong here. She had only come because the invitation had been vague, and the timing inconvenient enough that she'd felt guilty saying no. A last-minute +1. A seat filled out of politeness, not desire. She was useful that way, someone to complete the picture without being part of it. Her dress was nice. She'd chosen it carefully. Simple, dark blue, modest enough to feel safe. Still, it felt out of place among the gowns that shimmered and clung, worn by women who laughed easily and leaned into men in tailored suits who knew exactly where they belonged. She spotted couples everywhere, hands intertwined, fingers resting familiarly at waists. The easy intimacy of people who had someone else to rely on. Her chest tightened. She adjusted the strap of her purse and forced herself to take another step forward. The music was soft, romantic, heavy with strings. It pressed against her nerves, amplifying the quiet awareness she carried everywhere. You are alone here. Someone brushed past her, murmuring an apology that didn't quite reach their eyes. She offered a smile that felt automatic, polite, practiced. The kind of smile she'd learned as a single mother, pleasant enough to avoid questions, distant enough to avoid pity. She scanned the room, looking for her friend, but all she saw were strangers. Beautiful strangers. Confident strangers. People who didn't flinch when their phones buzzed, or glance at the door as if expecting someone to come looking for them. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced down instinctively. A photo filled the screen. Her daughter, curled up asleep with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, lashes dark against flushed cheeks. The babysitter had sent it with a single message. All good. She finally fell asleep. Relief washed through her, quickly followed by guilt. She locked the phone and slipped it back into her purse, her throat tightening. She shouldn't be here. Not when part of her was always elsewhere. Not when she couldn't fully give herself to moments like this. Beautiful ceremony, wasn't it? A woman beside her said casually. She turned, startled, and nodded. Yes, very. The woman smiled and leaned closer. And how do you know the bride? Her mind went blank. Oh, through a friend, she said, the answer vague, because the truth was more complicated and less impressive. The woman nodded, already losing interest as her gaze drifted back to her partner. Ah, of course. Of course. She moved toward the edge of the room, closer to the wall, where she could observe without being observed. That was her skill. She watched as the bride glowed, surrounded by attention and love. Watched as toasts were made, laughter rising and falling like something she wasn't meant to touch. A man's voice behind her dropped low. You're not drinking. She stiffened slightly and turned. The man who stood there was impeccably dressed, his presence commanding even without effort. Dark hair, sharp features, a gaze that felt like it cut through the noise of the room. No, she said quickly. I'm driving. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Smart. Before she could respond, he was pulled away by someone else, swallowed back into the crowd. Her pulse lingered, unsettled. She exhaled slowly and retreated further, slipping past a row of tables and into the hallway beyond the ballroom. The noise softened instantly, replaced by muffled music and distant laughter. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. This wedding wasn't hers. This life wasn't hers. She loved her daughter fiercely. She wouldn't trade that love for anything. But nights like this, surrounded by perfect moments that highlighted everything she'd lost, made the ache sharper. Her chest tightened, breath catching as the weight of it all pressed down at once. She needed air, space, somewhere she didn't have to pretend she was fine. She pushed open the door to the women's restroom and slipped inside, locking it behind her. The quiet enveloped her. For the first time that night, she let her shoulders sag. And as she leaned against the cool marble sink, staring at her reflection, tired eyes, composed smile finally gone, she whispered the truth she'd been holding back all evening. I don't belong here. She didn't know yet that the man who would change that truth forever was already looking for her. The lock clicked softly into place, a small, definitive sound that felt louder than it was. She leaned back against the door, closing her eyes as if that alone could keep the world on the other side from seeping through the walls. The music from the ballroom reached her only in fragments now, muffled strings, distant laughter, like a reminder of something she wasn't meant to participate in. Her breath came unevenly. She crossed the tiled floor and gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection under the harsh bathroom lights. The woman looking back at her seemed composed at first glance, hair pinned neatly, makeup still intact. No one would have guessed how close she was to unraveling. That was the problem. She'd learned how to look fine. She pressed her palms flat against the counter and let her head drop forward, shoulders shaking as the first tear fell. Then another, then more, until the reflection blurred completely. She hadn't meant to cry. She'd told herself she wouldn't, but the whispers had followed her like ghosts. Is that her? I heard she has a child. No husband? At her age? She wiped at her cheeks angrily, embarrassed even though she was alone. She hated how quickly it still got to her. Hated that no matter how strong she became for her daughter, moments like this could still crack her open. A memory surfaced without permission. Standing in a courtroom years ago, holding her baby in her arms, while a man who had promised forever stared at the floor and said nothing. Walking out alone, the weight of single motherhood settling on her shoulders before she'd even learned how to carry it. Another memory followed, declining invitations, making excuses, slowly shrinking her world until it was safe and manageable. Until weddings like this felt like foreign territory. She slid down to sit on the closed toilet lid, elbows resting on her knees, her face buried in her hands. I just needed one night, she whispered. One night to feel normal. Her phone buzzed again inside her purse. She hesitated before pulling it out, afraid it might be something wrong. But it was another photo. Her daughter, now sprawled sideways across the bed, one arm flung over the stuffed rabbit, mouth slightly open in sleep. Her chest ached. I'm doing this for you, she murmured, pressing the phone to her heart. I promise. A tear dropped onto the screen. She wiped it away quickly, straightening as if someone might burst in and catch her breaking. She stood and turned the faucet on, letting cold water run over her wrists. The shock helped, grounding her back in the present. She practiced breathing slowly, counting silently until the tightness eased just enough. This was her hiding place. A locked door. A few stolen minutes to fall apart without witnesses. She reached for a tissue, dabbing carefully under her eyes, fixing the mascara that had dared to smudge. She checked her reflection again, forcing her shoulders back. Almost okay. Then, a knock sounded on the door. She froze. Her heart leapt into her throat, panic flaring instantly. She hadn't expected anyone to notice she was gone. She'd hoped the bathroom would be invisible, a place no one bothered to look. It's occupied, she called, her voice tighter than she liked. Silence followed. Then the knock came again. Slower this time. Deliberate. I know, a man's voice said calmly from the other side. Low, controlled, unmistakably confident. Take your time. Her pulse raced. She pressed her back against the counter, eyes fixed on the door. Who was this? Security? Someone sent to drag her back out? Someone annoyed that she'd disappeared from the party? I just need a minute, she said, fighting the tremor in her voice. You have it, the voice replied. I'll be right here. Something about the way he said it, unhurried, certain, sent a shiver through her. She swallowed hard, glancing at her reflection one last time. Her eyes were red but determined. Whatever waited on the other side of that door, she refused to be ashamed of needing this moment. She took a steadying breath and reached for the lock. The knock came again. Not loud, not impatient, measured. It echoed through the small bathroom like it had been meant for her alone, each tap deliberate enough to cut through the rush of blood in her ears. She stood frozen, fingers still curled around the edge of the sink, heart hammering so hard she was sure whoever stood outside could hear it. Her first thought was security. Someone had noticed her disappear. Someone had decided she didn't belong wandering the halls of a wedding like this, hiding where guests weren't meant to linger. She imagined a stiff apology, a forced smile, the humiliation of being escorted back into the ballroom with red eyes and flushed cheeks. Her second thought was worse, that someone had complained. She pressed her lips together, swallowing the sting of tears that threatened to return. "Yes?" she called, her voice unsteady despite her effort to sound composed. Silence followed for a beat. Then the voice came again, low, even, unmistakably calm. "Open the door." It wasn't a command shouted or softened into politeness. It was a statement, as if opening the door was already expected, already decided. Her breath caught. I just need a minute," she said, backing toward the mirror, suddenly acutely aware of how small the room felt. "I'll be out soon." "You're not in trouble," the voice replied. That stopped her. Trouble had been her assumption. Judgment. Consequences. People always wanted something when they found her hiding. She stared at the door, pulse racing. "Who is this?" Another pause. She imagined him standing there, unbothered by the delay, patient in a way that didn't feel forced. "Someone who noticed you left," he said, "and didn't think you should have to come back alone." Her throat tightened. The bathroom felt unbearably quiet now. She could hear the faint hum of the lights, the distant music seeping through the walls. Somewhere beyond the door the wedding continued. Laughter, clinking glasses. A world she had stepped out of because it felt too heavy to carry. "I don't think that's appropriate," she said weakly. A hint of something like amusement colored his voice. Not mocking, just knowing. "I think what's appropriate is letting you breathe." Her hand trembled as she reached for the lock, then stopped. "What if I don't open it?" she asked. "Then I'll stay right here," he said. "Until you do." The certainty in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She was tired of hiding, tired of being embarrassed by her own emotions, tired of shrinking to fit rooms she'd never been meant to disappear inside. She stepped forward and turned the lock. The door opened a few inches. He stood just beyond it, filling the hallway without crowding it. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that looked effortlessly tailored, like it had been made for him and no one else. His posture was relaxed, but there was an undeniable presence to him, something that made the air feel heavier, more focused. She recognized him instantly. The man she'd noticed earlier near the bar. The one people unconsciously made space for. The one conversations seemed to bend around. The most feared man in the room. His gaze softened when it landed on her. Not pity, not judgment. Recognition. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded once. "I just needed a moment." "So did I," he replied. That surprised her. "You?" "Yes." His eyes flicked briefly past her into the bathroom, taking in the closed stalls, the mirror, the evidence of someone trying to pull herself back together. Then he looked at her again. "This wedding is loud." She almost laughed. Almost. A woman's voice echoed faintly down the hall behind him, someone calling his name. He didn't turn. "Come with me," he said instead, offering his arm. The gesture stunned her. I can't," she said instinctively. "I don't want to cause a scene." "You won't," he replied calmly. "You'll stop being one." Her heart raced. "People are watching." "They always are," he said. Let them. She looked at his arm, steady, unyielding, then back up at his face. There was no pressure in his expression, no demand, just an open invitation that somehow felt safer than staying hidden. I don't even know you, she whispered. He held her gaze. I know. And you're still doing this? Yes. She searched his eyes for arrogance, found none. What she saw instead was intention, purpose. You don't belong in that bathroom, he said quietly. You belong where no one can make you feel small. Her chest tightened. Against every instinct she'd built to survive, she reached out. Her fingers rested lightly on his sleeve. The contact grounded her instantly. He nodded once, as if that was all the answer he needed, and gently guided her out of the bathroom and into the hallway. Behind them, the door closed softly. Ahead of them, the noise of the wedding swelled again. This time she wasn't walking back alone, and everyone would notice. He didn't rush her. That was the first thing she noticed as they stepped fully into the hallway. He adjusted his pace to hers without comment, his arm steady beneath her hand, his presence calm enough that her racing pulse began to slow despite itself. There was no interrogation, no curious glance meant to dissect her vulnerability. He didn't ask why she'd been crying. He didn't ask who had hurt her, or what she was running from. He simply walked beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd expected, tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. Broad-shouldered, composed, dressed in a way that didn't scream excess, but whispered power. His face was sharp, controlled, handsome in a way that didn't beg for attention, because it never needed to. People moved when they saw him coming, not dramatically, just instinctively. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Someone stepped aside a fraction too quickly. A waiter straightened as if bracing for inspection. It was subtle, but unmistakable. This was the man everyone feared. She felt it in the way the air seemed to bend around him, and yet his attention never left her. You don't have to explain anything, he said quietly as they approached the edge of the ballroom. Her throat tightened. I know, he interrupted gently. You don't owe me words. That undid something inside her. She'd spent years explaining herself. To teachers, to doctors, to other parents, to strangers who thought being a single mother entitled them to opinions. Words had become armor, carefully chosen, constantly ready. Now someone was telling her she didn't need them. The music swelled as they crossed the threshold into the ballroom again. Heads turned, whispers followed like ripples in water. Is that him? Who is she? Why is he with her? She felt the familiar urge to pull away, to release his arm and retreat back into invisibility before she became a topic of conversation. His hand tightened just slightly at her elbow. Stay, he murmured. Not a command, an anchor. They didn't stop near the center of the room. He guided her past it, toward a quieter corner where the light softened and the noise dulled. A space that felt intentionally chosen, protected without being hidden. She exhaled slowly, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He inclined his head. You looked like you needed an exit. She laughed softly, a sound edged with exhaustion. I always look like that. His gaze sharpened, not critically, but attentively. You shouldn't. She glanced up at him. You don't even know me. I know enough, he replied. You stood alone in a room full of people and still tried to make yourself smaller so no one else would feel uncomfortable. Her breath caught. That's not an insult, he added. It's observation. She swallowed. And what does that observation tell you? That you're tired, he said, and that no one here bothered to notice. Before she could respond, a man approached, confident, polished, clearly accustomed to being heard. Everything all right? He asked, eyes flicking between them with thinly veiled curiosity. Yes, the man beside her said calmly. The single word carried weight. The other man hesitated, then nodded. Of course. He retreated without another question. She stared after him. People listen to you. They know better than not to, he replied evenly. She turned back to him, studying his face. Who are you? A pause. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was choosing which part of it to give her. A man who doesn't like seeing women cornered, he said, and who doesn't ask twice when he knows what he wants to do. Her heart skipped. Which is? To make sure you leave this night standing, he replied. Not hiding. She looked down at her hand still resting on his arm, then back up at him. And after? That's up to you, he said. I don't drag people into my orbit. I offer them a way out of rooms that don't deserve them. The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. Why me? She asked. His gaze softened just slightly. Because you walked into a room full of celebration carrying the weight of an entire life by yourself. And no one should have to do that unseen. Tears threatened again, but this time she didn't feel the urge to hide them. He straightened subtly, his presence widening, shielding her from the curious glances that continued to drift their way. Stay here as long as you need, he said. Or leave. I'll make sure no one stops you. She nodded, grounding herself in the quiet strength of his offer. For the first time that night, she didn't feel like an intruder at the wedding. She felt like someone worth stepping out of hiding for. And she had the sudden, unmistakable sense that the man beside her never made the same offer twice. The shift happened the moment they stepped forward. Not when she felt his arm settle more securely around her waist, or when the music swelled again as they moved out of the quiet corner, but when the room noticed who she was walking with. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Laughter faded into murmurs. Heads turned openly now, no longer pretending discretion. The space between guests widened instinctively, as if an invisible line had been drawn, and no one wanted to cross it. She felt it all at once. The weight of attention, the electricity in the air, the awareness that this wasn't just curiosity. It was recognition. The man beside her didn't tighten his hold. He didn't guide her forcefully or rush her through the crowd. His arm rested around her with deliberate ease, a public claim that wasn't possessive, but unmistakable. He walked as if he belonged anywhere he chose to stand, and by extension, so did she. Her heart pounded, but something steadier replaced the panic she'd felt earlier. His presence anchored her, solid and unyielding. The whispers that followed no longer felt sharp. They dulled, sliding past her like distant noise. Is that him? Why is he with her? Who is she? She lifted her chin without thinking, posture straightening as if her body had finally been reminded how to take up space. A woman she recognized from earlier, one who had offered a tight smile and a quick assessment, froze as they passed. Her eyes widened just slightly, surprise breaking through polished composure. She caught her reflection in a mirrored pillar as they moved. The woman staring back looked different. Not because her dress had changed or her hair was suddenly perfect, but because she was no longer trying to disappear. She felt his hand shift subtly, fingers brushing her side in a quiet reassurance meant only for her. You're doing fine, he murmured. She nodded, breath steadying. They reached the center of the ballroom, directly beneath the chandeliers, the most visible place in the room. He didn't slow. He didn't hesitate. He stopped there. With her. The effect was immediate. A man near the bar lowered his glass, eyes narrowing in disbelief. A couple near the dance floor fell silent, hands still linked but forgotten. Even the bride, glowing, radiant, glanced over, confusion flickering across her face before something like understanding took its place. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. She felt it when his arm tightened just slightly around her shoulders, when his stance widened just enough to place himself between her and the rest of the room without shielding her completely. She wasn't being hidden. She was being presented. A voice cut through the quiet. I didn't realize you knew her. The man beside her turned calmly. You didn't need to. The answer was simple, final. The speaker faltered, offering a stiff nod before retreating. Her pulse raced, but not with fear, with disbelief. Moments ago, she'd been crying behind a locked door, convinced she didn't belong here. Now she stood in the most public space of the night, the center of attention. Not because she demanded it, but because someone powerful had chosen to stand with her. She felt the truth settle in her chest, heavy and liberating all at once. She had never been alone. She had just been unseen. His gaze dropped to her, softer now. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "We can leave whenever you want." She shook her head slowly. "Not yet." A corner of his mouth lifted, the barest hint of approval crossing his face. Music resumed hesitantly, the string quartet picking up where they'd faltered. People began to move again, though nothing returned to how it had been before. The room had recalibrated around them. She noticed how eyes flicked to his hand at her waist, how questions died unspoken on lips that suddenly knew better than to ask. The message was clear. She mattered. She always had. And as she stood there, no longer shrinking, no longer hiding, she felt something inside her begin to shift. A realization she hadn't allowed herself before. Being alone hadn't been her failure. It had been circumstance. And circumstances could change. With his arms still around her, she took a slow breath and let herself exist fully in the room. Seen, protected, undeniable. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone who belonged. And everyone else finally understood it too. They didn't stay in the center of the room for long. Not because she couldn't handle it, but because he chose not to make her endure more than necessary. After a few measured minutes, long enough for the message to land, long enough for the room to adjust, he guided her away from the crowd and toward a quieter terrace, overlooking the snow-dusted gardens outside. Cold air brushed her cheeks as the doors closed behind them, the noise of the wedding dimming to a distant hum. White lights twined along the railing, casting soft reflections over frost-kissed stone. The night felt still, suspended, like it was holding space for what needed to be said. She leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. That was a lot. "Yes," he agreed. "Which is why we're here." She glanced at him, curiosity sharpening. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Then why did you?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He rested his hands on the railing beside hers, not touching, but close enough that she felt his warmth through the winter air. "I noticed you when you arrived," he said finally. Her brows knit together. "I tried not to be noticed." "You were," he replied calmly. "Not because you were loud. Because you weren't." She turned toward him, surprised. "You stood near the door," he continued. "You watched the room like someone used to calculating exits. You smiled when spoken to, but you never lingered. You were present without taking space." Her throat tightened. "That doesn't sound like a compliment." "It is," he said. "It tells me you know how to survive." She swallowed. "A lot of people know how to survive." "Not like you do," he replied. "You carry responsibility the way some people carry weapons." The words settled into her chest, heavy and unsettling. "I saw you check your phone," he went on. "Not casually, purposefully. Like whatever was on the screen mattered more than everything in that room." She looked down at her hands. "My daughter." "I know," he said. Her head snapped up. "How?" "I asked," he replied simply. "And I watched the way your expression changed when you looked at that screen. That wasn't distraction. That was devotion." Her breath caught. "You moved through the room like someone who couldn't afford to fall apart," he continued. "Like you were holding everything together for someone else." She laughed softly, the sound edged with emotion. "That's what mothers do." "Yes," he said. "And that's why I noticed." She turned fully toward him now. "You said you don't drag people into your orbit." "I don't," he agreed. "But I don't ignore strength either." The lights reflected in his eyes as he met her gaze, unflinching. "You were alone in that room in a way most people will never understand. Not lonely, isolated. And still, you showed up." Her chest tightened. I didn't feel strong. You don't have to feel it to be it, he replied. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been pressing against her ribs since the bathroom door opened. And my child? His expression softened, unmistakably. The way you hold yourself, he said quietly. It's not for you. It's for someone who depends on you completely. She felt tears sting her eyes. She's my world. I know, he said. And anyone who can love like that deserves not to stand alone. The silence between them felt different now. Intentional, weighted with truth. I didn't come to that bathroom to rescue you, he added. I came because I recognized you. From what? She asked. From myself, he replied. From people who learned early that being unseen was safer than being vulnerable. She searched his face. You're not as untouched by all this as you pretend. A faint smile crossed his lips. No, I'm just better at hiding it. She leaned back against the railing, snowflakes drifting past like quiet confessions. So, this wasn't pity. No, he said firmly. It was respect. The word settled into her bones. I chose you, he continued, because you were already doing the hardest work there is, protecting someone else without protection of your own. Her voice was barely a whisper. And what does that mean? It means, he said, turning to face her fully, that I don't offer help lightly. And when I do, it's because I see something worth standing beside. For the first time that night, she didn't feel like she needed to explain herself. She felt understood, and that changed everything. The cold crept in slowly, settling into her fingers and the edges of her breath, but she barely noticed it. What she felt instead was the weight of what he'd just revealed. How carefully he observed the world, how deliberately he chose where to place his attention. And more importantly, who? You keep saying things like standing beside me, she said quietly, as if that means something very specific. It does, he replied. He turned slightly, angling his body so he could see the terrace entrance and the garden beyond it at the same time. The movement was subtle, almost unconscious, but she caught it. The way his awareness never fully rested. The way his calm didn't come from ease, but from control. What kind of man are you? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen once, briefly, then slid it back into his pocket. Somewhere inside the building, she heard a door open. Footsteps shifted. Voices lowered. You're safe here, he said, but I don't like pretending safety is automatic. Her stomach tightened. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's a warning. He leaned back against the railing, finally meeting her eyes fully. I don't run charities, he said, and I don't attend weddings for sentiment. She swallowed. People are afraid of you. Yes, the word landed cleanly, unapologetic. Because you enjoy that? She asked. Because fear is efficient, he replied, and efficiency keeps people alive. A chill slid down her spine, not from the cold, but from the truth threaded through his voice. I make decisions most people never have to, he continued. I protect what's mine by making sure threats never get close enough to try. And that protection, she hesitated, it has consequences. It does, he said. For me, and for anyone who stands openly with me. Her chest tightened. My daughter. His gaze sharpened instantly. Would never be exposed. You can't promise that, she said, fear breaking through her composure at last. I don't promise what I can't control, he replied. I eliminate what I can. The words should have terrified her. Instead, they grounded something deep inside her. She thought of the years she'd spent calculating risks alone, of late-night walks gripping keys between her fingers, of choosing safe neighborhoods, safe jobs, safe routines, all while knowing safety was never guaranteed. You're talking about a dangerous kind of protection, she said softly. Yes, he agreed. The kind that doesn't ask permission. She studied him, really studied him now, the restraint, the awareness, the quiet certainty that didn't seek approval. This wasn't bravado. It was lived-in authority. "And if I say no?" she asked. "Then you walk away," he said without hesitation. "Untouched, unfollowed. This night becomes a closed door." "And if I don't?" "Then people will notice," he said. "They already are. You'll be associated with me, watched, speculated about." She exhaled slowly. "Judged." "Yes," he said, "but never unprotected." Snow drifted down more heavily now, catching in her hair and on the shoulders of his coat. The lights reflected softly around them, turning the terrace into something unreal, beautiful and dangerous all at once. "I don't offer this lightly," he said, "and I don't offer it twice." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You're asking me to trust you with my life." "With your visibility," he corrected. "Your life? You've already been managing alone." That hit harder than she expected. She thought of her daughter again, of the world she was trying to navigate for both of them, of how exhausting it was to always be the only shield. "And you?" she asked. "What do you risk?" He met her gaze steadily. "Everything." The honesty in that answer left no room for illusion. Standing beside him wasn't a fairy tale. It was a choice, with teeth. And as she stood there in the winter air, the noise of the wedding fading behind them, she realized something that made her heart ache and steady all at once. For the first time in years, she wasn't being offered safety through invisibility. She was being offered protection through presence. Dangerous, public, unyielding. And the decision was hers. The terrace felt smaller after that. Not because of the walls or the cold, but because the truth he'd laid between them demanded space she didn't know how to make yet. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate spirals, settling into the silence that followed his last words. "You said this was my choice," she said quietly. "It is," he replied. "Which is why I'm going to be very clear." He turned toward her fully now, no longer scanning exits or the grounds below. Whatever he was about to say mattered enough that he gave it his complete attention. "I'm not offering charity," he said, "and I'm not offering romance dressed up as rescue." Her jaw tightened. "Good." A faint hint of approval crossed his face. "I'm offering structure." She frowned slightly. "Structure?" "A role," he clarified. "One that exists whether I'm in the room or not." The word role settled heavily in her chest. "I have properties," he continued. "Homes, offices, places where discretion matters and where people notice when something is off. I need someone I trust to oversee one of them, someone who understands responsibility, boundaries, and silence." Her heart skipped. "You don't trust easily." "No," he agreed, "which is why this matters." "And what does this role actually mean?" she asked. "It means stability," he said. "A salary you don't have to justify. A schedule that bends when your daughter needs you. Housing, if you want it, in a place no one approaches without permission." Her breath caught. "And the safety?" she asked carefully. He didn't hesitate. "Comprehensive. You and your child would be protected as an extension of my household. Not hidden, not shuffled aside." The word extension sent a ripple of unease through her. "And the cost?" she asked. "Because there's always a cost." "Yes," he said simply. She braced herself. "You would be tied to my world," he continued. "Seen with me, associated with my name. You wouldn't have the luxury of anonymity anymore." Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "And if something goes wrong?" she asked. "Then I deal with it," he said, "before it reaches you." "That's not what I meant," she said softly. "I mean, morally, legally, if I don't agree with something." His gaze sharpened, not defensively, but with interest. "Then you tell me." "And if I walk away later?" "You can," he said. "The protection doesn't vanish overnight. I don't punish people for leaving. She searched his face for manipulation, found none.
This isn't a cage,
he said quietly.
It's an anchor.
She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You're asking me to step into something permanent. I'm asking you to stop surviving on scraps of safety, he replied, and start building something that lasts. Her thoughts raced to daycare schedules, to rent payments, to the way she'd learned to live 3 steps ahead of disaster, to her daughter's small hands gripping hers when they crossed busy streets. What about her? She asked again. His expression softened. She would grow up knowing she's protected, that the world doesn't get to take things from her just because it can. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was offering. And what do you get? She asked. He didn't look away. Loyalty, honesty. Someone who sees what this life costs and chooses to stand anyway. She laughed softly, shaking her head. You make it sound almost reasonable. It is, he said, for the right person. Snow gathered at their feet, the terrace lights glowing softly around them. She looked at him, the danger, the steadiness, the impossible certainty, and felt the weight of the choice press down on her chest. This wasn't escape. It was entry. I need time, she said. You have it, he replied, but not forever. She nodded slowly. As they stood there, the wedding music swelled faintly behind them, unaware that everything had just shifted. Because this offer didn't just change her night. It changed the shape of her future. And once made, it could never be unseen. The decision didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the weight of the terrace air pressing against her lungs as she stared out at the snow-covered gardens below. The wedding music drifted faintly through the glass doors behind them, distant now, like something happening in another lifetime. She imagined leaving, walking back into the ballroom alone, offering a polite smile, making an excuse about an early morning, about her daughter, about a headache, calling a ride. Going home to her small apartment, to the familiar creak in the hallway floor, to the careful quiet she maintained after bedtime, so she wouldn't wake a sleeping child who relied on her for everything. She imagined waking up tomorrow exactly the way she always did, counting expenses, planning routes, measuring risks, carrying the invisible weight of being the only line of defense between her child and a world that wasn't gentle. Loneliness wasn't dramatic. It was efficient, predictable, safe in its own way. You were thinking about walking away, he said calmly. She didn't deny it. I'm thinking about what I lose if I don't. And what you lose if you do, he replied. She turned toward him, arms wrapping around herself. Independence isn't a small thing. No, he agreed. It's expensive. I fought hard for it, she said. Every decision I make is mine. Every mistake, too. And every burden, he added quietly. That stung because it was true. I don't want to be owned, she said. He met her gaze evenly. Neither do I. She huffed out a breath. That's not reassuring. It should be, he replied. I don't keep people by diminishing them. I keep them by giving them reasons to stay. She looked away again, watching snow gather along the edge of the stone railing. And if I become dependent on you? Then I've failed, he said. This only works if you remain capable of leaving. The honesty of that answer made her chest tighten. She thought of her daughter again, of how carefully she'd built a world small enough to manage, but large enough to breathe in, of the nights she lay awake listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, of how exhausted she was pretending she didn't need help. Protection came with strings. So did loneliness. One just pretended otherwise. What happens if I say yes? She asked softly, and discover I can't live in your world. Then you go, he said, with resources, with safety, without consequences. And people won't come looking? They won't, he said, not without my permission. She swallowed. The power in that should have terrified her. Instead, it made something inside her unclench. You make it sound simple, she said.
It's not, he replied. It's just clear.
She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold sting her cheeks, grounding her. She wasn't choosing romance. She wasn't choosing rescue. She was choosing between two kinds of risk. One familiar and lonely. The other dangerous, but shared. She opened her eyes and looked at him again. If I step into this, she said, I don't disappear into your shadow. You don't, he said immediately. You stand beside me, or not at all.
And my daughter?
She pressed.
Yeah.
She grows up knowing her mother didn't choose safety by shrinking, he said. She chose it by standing. Her breath caught. That did it. Not the money, not the protection, not the power. That. She straightened slowly, feeling something settle in her spine. Not fear, not certainty, but resolve. I won't promise forever, she said. I wouldn't accept it, he replied. I won't be quiet if I disagree. I expect you not to be. And I won't stop being myself, she finished. A faint smile touched his mouth. That's the point. Silence stretched between them, filled not with tension, but possibility. She took a breath. Then I'm not going back to the life where I do everything alone, she said. Not tonight. He nodded once, as if he'd known this was coming, but respected the weight of it anyway.
Come,
he said, extending his hand, not commanding, not possessive. An invitation. She took it. And as they turned back toward the wedding, she realized something profound and unsettling. She wasn't choosing to be protected. She was choosing to stop pretending she didn't deserve it. Whatever this life would demand of her, she would meet it standing, no longer alone, and no longer hiding. The night unraveled gently after that, as if the world had decided not to rush her anymore. They didn't return to the center of the ballroom. They didn't need to. Word had already spread in the subtle way it always did, through glances that lingered too long, through conversations that shifted when he passed, through the sudden absence of questions no one dared to ask aloud. She felt it in the way people looked at her now, not with curiosity, with understanding, with caution, with respect. He stayed close without crowding her, his presence steady and unspoken. He didn't parade her. He didn't announce anything. He simply existed beside her, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. And somehow, it was. A woman approached cautiously, offering a polite smile. It was nice to meet you, she said, eyes flicking briefly to him before returning to her. The message was clear. She mattered. As the night wore on, the weight she'd carried for so long began to ease, not disappear, but redistribute. She laughed once, surprised by the sound. She accepted a glass of water without feeling like she needed to justify it. She stood without scanning exits every few seconds. At some point, he glanced at her phone when it lit up again. Your daughter? She nodded. The sitter. Answer it, he said gently. She stepped aside, her heart tightening as she read the message. All good. She woke briefly, asked for you, then went right back to sleep. Tears pricked her eyes. She misses you, he said quietly. So do I, she admitted. He didn't hesitate. Then we should go. The car ride was quiet, the city passing by in softened lights and falling snow. She watched the streets she knew from a new angle, aware of the security moving smoothly around them without being intrusive. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt held. When they arrived, he walked her to her door. No assumptions, no pressure, just presence. You don't have to decide anything else tonight, he said. This stands as it is. She nodded. Thank you. For trusting me, he replied. Inside, she checked on her daughter, smoothing hair from her warm forehead, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Standing there in the dim light, the reality of what had changed finally settled in. She hadn't just met a powerful man. She had been seen. Not as a woman in need of rescue, not as someone to be pitied or managed, but as a mother who had carried too much alone for too long. When she returned to the doorway, he was still there, patient and unhurried.